You know what's funny about Captain America Civil War? When that movie came out in 2016, most people walked out of the cinema thinking Steve Rogers was the hero and Tony Stark was the paranoid one overreacting. But now, after everything the MCU has shown us over the past 10 years, WandaVision, Secret Invasion, Damage Control, the collapse of the Avengers, governments turning on heroes, innocent people constantly getting caught in the crossfire, I think Tony Stark was right. And the craziest part is that the MCU has spent the last decade accidentally proving his argument over and over and over again.
Stop.
Because Civil War was never really about Bucky. It was never really about Zemo. It wasn't even really about the Sokovia Accords. It was really about one question. What happens when superheroes become too powerful to answer to anyone? And looking at where the MCU is now, Tony may have seen the future before anyone else did. So with Avengers Doomsday coming and the MCU now dealing with multiversal chaos, governments losing control and heroes operating completely unchecked, I wanted to go back and revisit what might actually be the most important Marvel movie ever made. Because Civil War didn't just split the Avengers, it fundamentally changes the MCU forever. And 10 years later, Tony Stark's side of the argument looks more and more reasonable, definitely more so than people wanted to admit at the time. Now, first things first, Steve Rogers is still emotionally the heart of the movie. That's why the audience naturally sided with him. Because from Steve's perspective, he's protecting his friend. He's right to not trust governments either. This is the same guy who found out Hydra had infiltrated S.H.I.E.L.D. at the highest level. Of course, Steve doesn't want politicians deciding who the Avengers fight and where they go. I mean, that makes total sense. But the problem is, Tony isn't arguing from ideology anymore. He's arguing from consequences. And by the time Civil War happens, Tony Stark is basically carrying years of guilt on his back. New York, Ultron, Sokovia, the deaths caused by his mistakes. And then the movie opens with Lagos. Wanda accidentally kills innocent civilians while trying to stop Crossbones. And from Tony's perspective, this is exactly the problem. The Avengers have become so powerful that one mistake levels buildings and kills people. That scene with the mother confronting Tony at MIT is one of the most important scenes in the entire MCU. Because for maybe the first time, the movie stops showing superhero destruction as cool spectacle and starts showing the human cost behind it. And Tony realizes something important. The world is eventually going to stop tolerating this. And yeah, he was right, because what happens after Civil War? The Avengers collapse. Half the team goes underground, communication breaks down, trust breaks down, and then Thanos arrives. Now yes, people always argue, well, if the Avengers stayed together, they would have beaten Thanos. Well, that's true. That's part of why Tony was right. The lack of structure destroyed the team. Civil War weakens the Avengers so badly that when Infinity War happens, everyone is scattered and divided. Tony is stuck on Titan, Cap is operating illegally, Vision and Wanda are isolated, nobody's coordinated. Earth's mightiest heroes, the strongest team on Earth, completely falls apart. Even after Endgame, there isn't really an Avengers team anymore. There's just powerful individuals doing whatever they want. And that becomes a massive problem in the post-Endgame MCU. Because look at what starts happening. Wanda completely enslaves an entire town in WandaVision because of grief and trauma, and nobody can stop her. That is literally Tony Stark's argument from Civil War. Unchecked, superpowered people become dangerous. Then damage control starts becoming militarized. Governments begin treating enhanced individuals like potential threats instead of heroes. Whether people like it or not, the action totally makes sense based on everything that has happened in the MCU at this point. Because imagine living in the world as a normal human being. Aliens invade New York, a robot nearly destroys the planet, a purple alien wipes out half the universe, magic users rewrite reality, and celestials start emerging out of the earth. At some point, governments would step in. And that's what makes Civil War so fascinating now. Because back in 2016, Tony looked controlling, but watching it now, he almost looks realistic. And the scary part is, Tony himself was also proof that powerful people can become dangerous without accountability. That's why the movie works so well, because Tony caused Ultron. Steve's side isn't completely wrong either. That's what makes Civil War probably the most mature conflict the MCU has ever done. Neither side is fully right, neither side is fully wrong. But over time, the universe itself started leaning more towards Tony's concerns. Another reason this movie has aged so well is because this is where the MCU stopped being simple. For Civil War, the MCU was mostly building upward. Heroes unite, big bad appears, everyone fights together. Civil War changed that. Suddenly the MCU becomes political, personal, and morally messy. Friends become enemies, heroes make selfish choices, people lie to each other. That shift is what allowed movies like Infinity War and Endgame to hit as hard as they did emotionally. Because once Tony and Steve break apart in Civil War, that wound never really heals properly until Endgame. That final Avengers Assemble moment only works because we watched these people destroy each other first. And going back now, it's honestly insane how important Civil War was to everything that came after it. This movie introduced Spider-Man, introduced Black Panther, destroyed the Avengers, set up Infinity War, and it changed Tony and Stark's relationship forever. And in a weird way, it also predicted the future problems of the MCU itself. Because now the MCU is dealing with gods, mutants, multiversal beings, magical chaos, and insanely powerful individuals operating without oversight. Exactly what Tony feared. Now, do I think Tony would have wanted the extreme surveillance state type world we start seeing later? No. I do think he understood something before everyone else did. Power without accountability eventually becomes dangerous, even when the people involved are good people. This is where I think Tony Stark becomes impossible to ignore in hindsight, because Tony's argument was never really about control. It wasn't about his ego, and it wasn't about governments owning the Avengers. It was about keeping the team together before everything completely fell apart. And that's exactly what ends up happening after Civil War. Just fracture, communication breaks down, and the trust disappears. And when the biggest threat the universe has ever seen finally arrives, Earth's greatest heroes are divided, isolated, and completely unprepared. Tony was trying to prevent that, because think about it. If the Avengers had accepted some level of oversight and compromise, the team probably would have stayed intact. Steve stays with the Avengers. Tony and Steve are still communicating. Vision and Wanda aren't isolated. Half the team doesn't become fugitives. And when Thanos arrives, you potentially have the full might of the Avengers operating together as one unit instead of scattered across the galaxy fighting separate battles. People always talk about Civil War like Tony lost the argument because the Accords weren't perfect. But I actually think the MCU spent the next 10 years proving why Tony was so terrified of the alternative. Because the alternative was chaos. And that chaos cost lives, a lot of lives. And this is where I think Steve Rogers, as much as I love the character, makes a decision that ultimately hurts everyone around him. Because Steve spends the entire movie looking at the situation from his own personal perspective. From his point of view, governments can't be trusted, institutions become corrupt, Bucky deserves protection, and freedom matters more than oversight. And yeah, he may not be wrong about those things individually, but the problem is that Steve's decisions stop being about the bigger picture. They become personal. Once Bucky is involved, Steve is no longer acting as Captain America leading the Avengers. He's acting as Steve Rogers, protecting his friend at any cost. And that choice destroys the team. Now, obviously Tony reacts emotionally too, especially after learning the truth about his parents. But before the final reveal, Tony is still trying to hold the Avengers together. Steve isn't. Steve chooses Bucky over the unity of the Avengers. And again, emotionally we understand why he does it, but strategically, Tony was right. Because once the Avengers break apart, the world becomes dramatically more vulnerable. And I honestly think the MCU itself proves that over and over and over again afterwards. Look at everything that happens post-Endgame. Enhanced individuals operating unchecked, governments panicking, trust collapsing, cities being destroyed, reality being manipulated. The scale of damage just keeps escalating. And what's interesting is that Tony Stark understood that escalation before almost anyone else did. He understood that eventually the Avengers couldn't just operate like a group of friends punching bad guys. The stakes had become too big, and I think that's why Civil War has aged so well. Because when you watch it now as an adult, especially after seeing everything that's happened in the MCU, Tony's side starts feeling less paranoid and more realistic. When Civil War first released, people mostly viewed Steve as the clear hero and Tony as the emotionally unstable one. But hindsight changes things, because the further the MCU goes, the more Tony's fears actually come true. The Avengers collapse, the world loses trust in heroes, unchecked power becomes dangerous, and eventually the universe itself falls into chaos. Exactly what Tony was afraid of. I think if the Avengers had stayed united, if Steve and Tony had found a compromise instead of tearing each other apart, there's a very real chance Infinity War and everything that followed plays out very differently. Maybe Thanos still wins, but maybe millions, maybe billions of lives could have been saved if Earth's greatest heroes weren't divided when the war finally came. And that's why I think Civil War is still one of the smartest movies Marvel has ever made, because it doesn't become more simple over time. It becomes more complicated. And 10 years later, I genuinely think Tony Stark was right. Not because he was perfect, because the Sokovia Accords were flawless, but because he understood something before everyone else did. Power without accountability eventually leads to disaster, even when the people holding that power are heroes. And the MCU itself spent the next decade proving him right.
W's in the shot.